Let me first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which we meet today, the members of the great Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, particularly those of the Wurundjeri whose lands these are. I like to do that at the start of speeches. I remind people that we're a very young city. We're only 181 years old, founded in 1835. Our first peoples, however, are the oldest continuous culture in the world. I'm going to kind of pick up a bit where Angus left off, because quite rightly he has different sorts of challenges, and we've been talking there about how do you make sure, in his words, that there aren't elements of cities that get left behind? How do we share the resources, the knowledge, the skills we have to make sure that all benefit, not just the centre of cities? Now, while I have a vision for Melbourne as a very sophisticated, competitive, forward-thinking city, I understand what it is that Angus was talking about, and we can, in questions, if you like, explore that in our very own city. But nevertheless, the example I'm going to give you is one where I'm shamelessly proud of the successes we've had. And I'm going to talk about some of those and why they have happened. Because I think we're at the centre of the global thinking that Angus was talking about, of the key ingredients for a livable, sustainable, prosperous city. For me, it's an intersection of three elements. The first is what's there, the built form and the natural environment. And I think particularly of Jeff's slide that took us from 1.0 to 4.0 when I think about that built form and built environment. It's about who's there, the people. And we were talking also during two of the presentations and introductions about attracting and retaining the best talent. And finally, it's about what's going on. It sounds pretty simplistic, doesn't it, those three elements? But if we get those things right, that built form and infrastructure, the right type of development, if you like, if we get the right vibrancy, then we get what my friend Jan Gehl would describe as a city for people. And if you think about it, what else is a city for? It's not for motor cars, driverless or not. It's not for buildings. It's not for roads. Cities are for people and of people. And if we keep that in the forefront of our minds as we make our decisions, whether that's for infrastructure or any of the other built forms we've talked about, then at the end you will get a good outcome. And that's for two reasons. One, if you think about global business now, and Siemens is a wonderful example of that, global businesses now think about cities when they're thinking about investment and projects. Not about nations, about cities. And so you better have those ingredients right if you wish to sit at the table with those global businesses. And second, as I said before, it's our ability to attract and retain talent. How do we get those creative, able, hard-working people to base themselves here? Because as Angus said earlier, they can base themselves anywhere around the world. There is a global market for that talent. But I would argue it's based around place. And I would point you back again to Jeff's slide, which talked about Angus's policy about smart cities, when you think about attracting and retaining the best. People want to be in an energised city. We had Ian Harper up here before in the slideshow with the quote from the work he did with CEDA. He did some work for me some time ago looking at the financial services sector and whether we had a hub of financial services, and yes we do. It starts up at Castleton Place, runs down Collins Street, finishes up between NAB and the National Australia Bank. We sent him back to talk to the CEOs and a range of other people, and David Murray doesn't mind me quoting this, I've asked him. We asked David, how do we help you to grow your business when he was chair of the Future Fund? What can we do as a city to intersect with you? And his answer kind of surprised us. His answer was, keep it a livable city, because that's what I need to attract and retain the best and the brightest. So it's not just an economist title. Have I mentioned yet we're the most livable city in the world for the 6th year in a row? If I haven't, that's been most remiss of me. I've made my annual phone call to Gregor Robertson, the Mayor of Vancouver. He usually gets the news in the middle of the night, but I feel he needs to know straight away. And we are blessed. We do have a central core that brings together commerce, education, health, sport, cultural and residential areas, all of which can be accessed on foot, by bike, in a car, on free public transport within the grid, or 24-hour public transport on the weekends. And that's one of the reasons we also get ranked in the top global elite cities very regularly. We're kind of growing faster, not just in population terms, but in economic terms than the rest of the nation. And there are reasons for that. Our daytime and our nighttime economy is outstripping the nation. And I'm just talking now not of metropolitan Melbourne, Greater Melbourne, I'm talking about the 38 square kilometres for which I'm responsible for. When I took over as Lord Mayor in 2008, the economy of that 38 square kilometres was $70 billion a year. 8 years later, it is $91 billion a year. Now, while I would like to take sole and singular credit for that, I think it's more due to the work that many of you are doing in your businesses, because you see this as a place to do business. You're seeing an extraordinary construction boom out there, and the two go together. When you think about that knowledge economy, more about that later, and the workforce, the young, creative, able workforce that is in that knowledge economy, they want to live close to where they work, they want something that's affordable, they don't need a car, and so that is driving this incredible boom in 1- and 2-bedroom apartments that you're seeing throughout the city at the moment. Again, since I've been Lord Mayor, we have approved developments, $28.4 billion. That is a remarkable upsurge in construction and all of the allied high-value jobs that go with it. We set the record for the last 2 years in investment in the CBD in Australia, around $6 billion of investment, according to Knight Frank. So these are great indicators about what we're doing. So it's worthwhile stopping and pausing and thinking, if this is the success story that Angus is driving for more generally, what is it that's made us so successful? Well, there's a confidence here. If I look at the next 5 to 10 years, there's $42 billion worth of projects already on the drawing board to be rolled out in that period of time, all within 2 kilometres of the CBD. When you talk about units, if you want to know what sort of residential growth we are having, how about these for numbers? We have 20, this is just the centre of the city, remember, 20,000 residential dwellings currently under construction. A further 31,000 have been approved and 25,000 are in the pipeline. And that construction boom, although it will come off, we foresee continuing for the next 3 to 4 years. If you look at something else, whenever I see these now, they come with a hotel development if they're a mixed-use development. And that's because our hotel sector is experiencing high occupancy rates, around 86%. If you're at 5-star, you're above 95%. That's because we've got those international overnight visitors growing at about 10% a year. We are very keen on collecting data, and I'll come back to one of the points that Angus made earlier a bit later. We have a development activity monitor. It shows us that 9,500 new hotel rooms and serviced apartments are in the development pipeline. About 36,000 square metres of retail spaces under construction and about 134,000 more in the pipeline. That's not enough, by the way. If you're thinking about, how much that is, that's about 2 emporiums. And I'll speak a bit later about why I'm a little worried about the residential versus retail and commercial growth of the city. Let me focus for a moment on the strength of retail. Yesterday I opened Debenhams, their first Australian store out of the UK. The week before it was Michael Hill, the great New Zealand jeweller who opened in the Bourke Street Mall. In something that gave me enormous pleasure, that flagship of Sydney, David Jones, announced last month that they were moving their entire headquarters to Melbourne because, as the CEO said, Melbourne is just the place to be. Took them 100 years, but look, that's okay. But then if you look around our city, you will notice in the retail core, vacancy rates are ridiculously low. If you think about Collins Street and Elizabeth Street, vacancy is about 1.9%. There are 2 shops available on those streets if you're looking for a retail outlet. On Swanston Street, we're about 1.3% vacancy. If you want the Bourke Street Mall or any of our laneways, forget it, they're full. So that tells you that there isn't much supply left there. And that's because, for instance, the number of international retailers coming into the city has doubled since 2010. Enormous impetus, and it's accelerating as well. We predict that demand for retail space in the city will remain exactly that strong. And we also know we need a 21st century foundation to maintain a 21st century economy. So we've geared our spending at the city to support that vibrant economy and to create opportunities in our community. In the way Angus was talking about, it's his challenge to help other cities do that when they don't have some of our natural advantages. I'm very proud that we've overseen the largest investment in infrastructure in this city's history in the time that I've been there. We've overseen the completion of generational community infrastructure projects. Who would have thought in the central city, just in the last 4 or 5 years, one of them in partnership with Lend-Lease, we would deliver 3 new libraries in the inner city. And that's a sign of the community infrastructure we need to develop. And we've looked at sustainability as well. We've got international accolades for our urban forest strategy, for our stormwater harvesting, for our LED lighting strategy. These are things that modern, sustainable, prosperous cities just do. And I've been lucky because some of the people that you well know in the city, people like Professor Rob Adams, who for 30 years has been transforming our city, transforming our streets, creating an integrated network of bike paths. When you walk outside in our streets, you don't step on asphalt, you walk on bluestone. Why? Because it's a wonderful material for walking. And something like 90% of journeys in the city are walking journeys once you get in here. Is that to tell me to stop? I've got miles to go yet. Anyway. And I'm delighted to tell Stephen, of course we support our university sector, drivers of so much in that knowledge economy. So whether it's universities, our retail and hospitality sector, our arts and culture, our small business startups, and again, I was saying to Angus before, you know, these don't have to be gigantic, expensive programs. Sometimes some very strategic seed funding of quite modest types can have quite remarkable outcomes. We spend around $60 million on those sectors, trying to invigorate those sectors each year. And as I said, it is paying dividends. Go back to retail for a moment, the David Jones announcement, but that followed a steady stream of companies that have set up their Asia Pacific headquarters here in Melbourne. GoPro, Uniqlo, Square, Zendesk, New Cold, that's to name a few. And as I said, we try to invest in small business because it is the backbone. You know, the big businesses are here, the global businesses are here, but the backbone of the city's economy is still those small businesses. Small to medium business grants, we've made about $7 million over the course of our program of making small grants to those businesses, about 350 of them. We started doing that in 1997. We revamped the program a few years ago, but we estimate that that $7.8 million that we've invested has actually generated something like $90 million of turnover and created 900 new jobs. And that's on quite modest amounts of investment. If you think that's going back to 97, typically at the moment, we put about $250,000 into that program each year. But when you have a look at the returns we get, we should be putting more in. And so, because as Stephen said, it is an election cycle after all, what I'm going to promise if I am re-elected, and let's hope I am, but even if I'm not, I hope that this happens, we should be putting in up to $1 million a year, increasing that fourfold for grants to small businesses. And that might be setup, it might be expansion, it might be to relocate in the city, it might be to help them with export. And I make the commitment that I will do that because even though by federal standards that's an extremely modest amount of money, have a look at the downstream benefit we get by making those early investments in some of those small, smart, nimble businesses. We've also tried to invest in the festivals of the city. You know, a city needs to feel vibrant. So whether it's Moomba, Melbourne Spring Fashion Week, Melbourne Music Week, Christmas and New Year's Eve, why do we invest in them? Not so that people can have a good time, but because, well, partly so they can have a good time, but it's actually good business for the city. If you think about the people that are brought to the centre, you know, the Moomba weekend, when I first came here, I had to make the decision, am I going to shut this thing down after 55 years, or are we going to put some money into it and do it properly? Well, now, over the Labor Day weekend, 1.2 to 1.4 million people will come in to take part in Australia's biggest community festival. To shift gears for a moment, one of the other things that I'm worried about when you think about global competitiveness and why people want to come here, you've got to keep your city safe. There's got to be a sense of public safety. And I would flatter us that we've done the hard work here. At the one end, there's policing and there's no replacement for that uniform, but through a range of initiatives, whether it's CCTV cameras, whether it's working with the Salvation Army with street teams late at night, whether it's good lighting, all-night public transport, closing down whole streets to make taxi ranks, things you might not have thought of, putting flowers outside Town Hall, designing in safety through environmental design. All of those things are necessary for people to feel this is not just a profitable place to work, this is a safe and pleasant place to be. And we're bucking that trend too. Crimes against the person in our municipality have gone down by 15% over the last 5 years. Interestingly, food sales are up by something like 33%. Alcohol sales are down by about 3%. So there's something happening in that nighttime economy that is the direction that we want to head in. But I want to go back to Angus's point. It's important here too that we create opportunities for everyone in our community. So I'm proud that we're the first council in Australia to have a reconciliation action plan, an Indigenous heritage action plan. And one of the outcomes of that is putting some young Indigenous men and women on a strong and rewarding career path more than any other council. I'm proud of our record in looking after vulnerable people. If there's one thing I worry about our city, and you'll see it as you walk out there, I worry that we're losing the battle in homelessness. And we can't do that alone. We're going to need to work with all of our agencies, with the state government, with our federal colleagues. You know, in a city as affluent as ours, to walk out and see people sleeping rough is not just an affront to me. It makes me feel ashamed. And there's something that we can do about that too, but we're going to need to. We've provided 200 apartments in the CBD for the homeless, and it's just not enough. We're going to have to build more. Clearly, we're going to have to do more. But the funny thing is that the reason I don't get disheartened, but I worry because there's never been a time when we've been more joined up. Minister Porter, who's Angus's colleague, Minister Foley here, ourselves, there's never been more money put into it. We tripled our budget for homelessness to $3 million this year, and yet we've still got that problem out there. So we need to make sure that people are not left behind, particularly those who are most vulnerable. To go back to something slightly happier, I actually want to set Melbourne up as Australia's city of opportunity. And I mentioned before the knowledge economy and why it's so important. You might not know the City of Melbourne has a flag, but we do. I have it proudly on the front of my car. I would recommend it to you as a strategy. Go down to Arthur Daly's and buy a plastic flag. Stick it on the front of your car. You turn up at the MCG and they say, I've got no idea who this bloke is, but he's got a flag on the front of his car. Here, have the Prime Minister's parking spot. So I just recommend that to you for tonight. But on that flag, there is a fleece, there's an ox, there's a whale and a sailing ship. Our first prosperity, primary production. Walk around our city and you'll see the bones of our second wave of prosperity. The beautiful Victorian architecture that came out of gold and when we were the wealthiest city in the world. Our third wave of prosperity came in the 20s and 30s when we discovered cheap and plentiful, if dirty, brown coal in the Latrobe Valley, and it drove our manufacturing sector. And we're now seeing that recede. But you know what? We also look at employment. We do a census of land use and employment. And we can tell you that even though manufacturing in the automotive industry will cost us 25,000 jobs in Victoria, we've generated 130,000 new jobs in the high-value knowledge sector in the last 8 years. And that's where the new prosperity is going to come from. We had a report by SGS Economics and Planning, and they tell us that job growth between 2002 and 2015, a little over a decade, in the CBD, employment grew by 40%. If they looked forward to the next 20 years, jobs growth in the Honourable grid alone could be in the order of 61%. So there is something going on in the centre of cities that is the attractor for the jobs, for the activity, and for that high-value work. But that is going to require additional commercial office space of about 2.5 million square metres if we're going to grow in employment terms. And that was the worry I spoke about before, something you might want to think about in our city. If I go back to the period between 2005 and 2010, commercial and residential development was about on a par. Between 2010 and 2015, residential development was outstripping commercial by 2.5 to 1. If I look at that pipeline I described earlier, residential outstrips commercial by 4 to 1. Now, I'm not one for market interventions, but those of you in business can see when you look at that scarcity of retail opportunity that I described before and that slowing down of commercial building, we're going to have to change gear if we're going to continue to accommodate the jobs that we want in the centre of the city. And it may be that we need to think about incentives to make sure we do have more mixed use. Because if we don't, if we continue these trends, then office vacancy rates continue to tighten, that increases competition and it puts upward pressure on rentals. If you look at vacancy rates at the moment, there's not much room to spare. In Docklands, there's 3.4% vacancy rate. In the central city, it's 4.2, and out in the eastern core, it's 3.6. And my ambition is for a mixed-use city, not one that skews entirely to residential or to commercial, but balances those needs. And that means we need to think about what we're going to do to redress that balance. As I come to the end, let me think about something, I mean, let's face it, you can go into any pet shop in Swanston Street and the parrots are talking about disruption. It seems to be the new word, but nevertheless, it's an important concept. And we've got to think about how do we plan our city, how do we make it a resilient city, which we've done very successfully with many of our partners here from local government during the Rockefeller work that we had done so well by Toby Kent, the City of Melbourne, our Chief Resilience Officer. So whether it's something that is man-made, like Melbourne Metro or the Western Distributor or the Westgate widening or the expansion of Australia's largest container port, they are all right in the middle of our city. And we've got a plan now for our business continuity as we build that necessary infrastructure, and they are all necessary, but that will be disruptive. Add to that one of the great experiments of the world. Up in Sydney, they are very focused on Barangaroo, and so they should be. It's a critical 22-hectare site that is crucial to the city. Think about our city and urban renewal. South Bank is about 90% complete. Docklands is about 60% complete. We haven't started on Eagate, the railway yards up on the edge of Etihad. Arden-Macaulay, between North Melbourne and Kensington, is about 155 hectares. And of course, there's Fisherman's Bend, stretching from the edge of the city back towards South Melbourne. If you add all of those up, that's about 650 hectares of urban renewal over the next 50 years. And the challenge will be to get that right. And how do we get it right? I seem to be mentioning you a lot here, Angus, but I'm coming back to you again here. I had the privilege of working with Mike Bloomberg when he was Mayor of New York, that great city. And he has a wonderful party trick. He pulls that revered American greenback out of his pocket. And Mike can pull a few out if he needs to, believe me. And he kind of snaps it in front of his audience. And he says, "This is our greenback. On it, it says, 'In God we trust.' And we do. The rest of you, bring data." And he means that. He means that good public policy decision-making must be driven by good data. Angus mentioned data and the amazing work the federal government is doing. I wish I'd known that you were offering $50 million for us to put our 100 data sets out there, Angus, but we have done that on a world-class open data platform, and we think that is very powerful. The data for all those disruptions exists now, or it will. We're opening up more of our data, collaborating with startup sectors, trying to be an open global city, because they're the cities that attract talent and they attract investment. And that's one of the reasons Angus was talking about the importance of Data 61. It's why we work with Rockefeller and IBM. It's why we focus on the startup sector, where those small business grants can make such a difference, because they don't have to be grand enterprises. They can start quite small. If you think not only of how you can help them, but how you attract the big ones here. Businesses that have opened here recently include Facebook, LinkedIn, Datacom, and Electronic Arts. Looking ahead, Knight Frank tell us that the tech-based companies and corporates that are currently looking for space are looking for 50,000 square metres in Melbourne. Seek, Ericsson, Samsung, all looking for space in the CBD. So, finally, my conclusion. You would know my ambition for the city is to be a competitive city, a prosperous city, a sustainable city, high quality of life, attracting the best and the brightest, people who have the knowledge and skills to drive the next wave of innovation and economic growth, and do so in a way that is sustainable. You know, you've got to be ambitious for your city. I think all of those elements are crucial. That's my vision for Melbourne. But I don't think ambition is enough. It's going to take very careful stewardship. It's going to take great collaborations and partnerships with people like business, industry, state and federal governments. We've got to be joined up if we want to be that ambitious, and I think we all do want to be. So finally, I certainly welcome the opportunity that was thrown out by Angus earlier today to enter into meaningful partnerships with the Australian government to deliver on the agenda we share. Our cities, and I don't just mean ours, I mean them all, our cities' prosperity and sustainability, because in the end, that's our nation's sustainability and prosperity as well. Thanks for having me today.